Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary from ACMI Education. I would like to, before we start this session, acknowledge that Alex and I are coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we wanted to pay respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all First Nations and these people of this land and who may be present with us in this lesson today. Can I please introduce Alexander Bacalja, in the Senior Lecturer of English and Literacy Education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and Language and Literacy Research Hub. I'm just letting you know that we are online today, coming to you live, but a reminder that recording this session will be available on ACMI Education's YouTube afterwards. I'll throw to Alex. Please a reminder, any questions we'll have time for at the end of this session. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to those who are viewing with us now live, or those who are viewing on the ACMI YouTube channel in the future. Obviously, I have an interest in video games, I have an interest in reading, and I've got an interest in how these two things might come together and do something in schools, in classroom environments. And I think that the doing of the something is a kinds of activities that I'm hoping we can problematize and challenge today. This is part two in a three-part series. Part one focused on moving us beyond engagement, moving us beyond the idea that because games are engaging and fun and interactive, we can just put them in classrooms and we can achieve our learning goals. What we were trying to suggest in that first session is that games might be leveraged for some of the challenging aspects of schooling, for building kind of conceptual or subject-specific conceptual learning, but that we need to be sensitive to pedagogy, to kinds of teaching practice that might be necessary to bridge games and conceptual learning. This session will focus on reading, or rather kinds of meaning making that we should consider when we're looking at how we will provide opportunities for students to play and make sense of games. And our third and final session, we'll look at some of the nuts and bolts, the logistical questions around planning and designing a video game centered curriculum. How might we think about configurations of technologies and people in classrooms? So why is it that those of us with an interest in games and that might be thinking about game-based learning should spend a little bit of time considering questions of reading and texts? And I think in asking this question, we need to consider the role of knowledge in schools and where knowledge comes from. And one way to address this is through this thing called texts and the role that texts play in supporting school learning. And Michael Apple did some great work in this space in the late 80s, looking in particular at the role of textbooks in carrying knowledge or contributing to knowledge in schooling. And he suggested that it wasn't necessarily the curriculum or mandates that dictated what was happening. It was by and large the standardized year level or grade level school textbook. And his report found that the vast majority of class time, over 75%, was spent with these textual materials. So they're clearly significant technologies, if you like, associated with school learning. And at least 40 years have passed since Apple's work. And you don't need me to tell you that the textual landscape has changed. We still have textbooks in classrooms. But what you can see on your screen is that we have a whole range of other kinds of texts that now carry some of the burden of building knowledge or contributing to knowledge construction. We've got our traditional large publishers like Pearson and McGraw-Hill that produce traditional print-based texts, but also produce a suite of digitized versions of those texts and more interactive texts. We've got our video streaming sites like YouTube and TED Talks that provide usually free access to a whole range of textual resources that seek to carry knowledge. And then we have some more, custom or bespoke providers like the copyright agencies, Reading Australia resources, and of course, ACMI's game lessons and other resources that ACMI provides. So what we see with this range of texts is that there are many ways in which knowledge is now constructed in the classroom, or many kinds of texts through which we might want to build knowledge with students. But this also requires us to think a little bit about these texts as cultural objects. And I would encourage us to look beyond these cultural objects as doing the work that we need them to do, that culture is less a static thing bound up in the texts themselves and more a process, a social and cultural process between, learners, students, teachers, and the cultural texts themselves. And clearly, video games are one kind of cultural text that are making their way into English classrooms. And it's here where I think we can ask some questions about how teachers are involved in the social and cultural processes that bring them into being. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to use examples from the game Stray. It's a beautiful game. As you're going to see in a moment, it places the player in the position of a cat called Cat with a capital C. And I just want to show you a short moment from the video now. Now, we don't really need to see much more than this. This is about a 15-second video that comes from the opening scene, even before we're in the position of game player. But we can start to ask some questions around what's happening. What are we focusing on? Perhaps we're tuned into the storm. Perhaps we're paying attention to the lightning. We're anticipating new lightning, the flashing, the sounds of the thunderstorm, the sounds of the rain. Maybe there's something about the cats that attracts our attention. Maybe we're looking at the movement of the cats. We're thinking about our own cats, knowing that they are the most superior pet to have in your home. And there's something about them that we're responding to. Maybe there's something about the camera pan or the zoom out, and we're anticipating something coming into the frame and what that something might be. The point here is that there isn't a single reading of this short video. There isn't a single kind of cultural knowledge that can be taken from this moment. We recognize that this has been designed by game designers, it's been coded algorithmically. But if we had a classroom of students, I think what we might find is that they were all making meaning with respect to different components or different elements in this short sequence. And of course, this brings us back to this notion of reading. So given today's interest in reading, it is important to take a couple of minutes to explore the concept of reading. And in particular, I want to try and move us from the notion of reading to the notion of meaning making. Clearly, reading is central to schooling and to education, and it's arguably one of the most debated concepts or practices in contemporary schooling. And we don't have time today to get into it in great detail, but I just want to touch on two ways of thinking about how reading has been conceptualized. And one approach is on the image on your left-hand side, the house, which at the top has reading comprehension and has a range of processes which we can presume from the image kind of combine together to hold up or build reading comprehension. And so you've got elements like, phonological awareness, print knowledge, the idea that little squiggles represent a symbol. These symbols are letters. Letters make sounds close to each other make words close to each other make sentences, etc. And this, in combination with our understanding of words, what words might mean, language, contributes to reading comprehension. And this is a model that supports print-based texts. And we can use this model to understand how someone might read a print-based text and generate readings. And it's a model that predominantly is interested in processes that might be taking place in our heads. But when we're thinking about digital games and schooling, I want to argue that there's value in thinking in a slightly different way, thinking of reading in terms of a wide range of modalities. And in here, I want to lean on the work from the New London group. And this was a group of scholars from around the world who were interested in how new technologies were being used inside and outside of schooling to contribute to knowledge construction or communication. And so, yes, they recognize that linguistic design, language, spoken or written, is really important. But what they were also taking note of was the way other modes were providing resources for meaning making. And so in the video we just saw, we might pay attention to the way sound effects, the audio design, was providing a resource for us to understand the mood or for the mood to be set. We might have paid attention to some of the gestures of the cats, the body physicality or their movement, to start to make some meanings about how we should perceive those cats, you know, how comfortable they are in their environment. You know, they're not scared of the storm, they're friendly with each other. So what this approach allows us to do is to break free from some of the assumptions associated with reading comprehension. Some of those assumptions include, you know, right answers versus wrong answers, or the notion that there's a correct way to read a particular text. From a meaning-making perspective, everyone is always meaning-making. It doesn't matter who views that little 15-second intro that we just saw, whether it's a 90-year-old who's never seen a video game in their life or a 15-year-old kid who games all day. Both of them will engage in kinds of meaning-making as a result of access to different modes available to them on the screen. And it's here where I think a return to Thorne's model, which we saw last week, can be useful. Because what we can do here is be reminded of the range of factors that are going to influence how meaning is made or the opportunities for meaning making in our classrooms. And so Thorne wants us to keep in mind how the purpose of a particular learning sequence, the context that we're in, what kinds of students, the technologies, the school subject, the values that we bring with us in terms of what we think is important. And given the context of this presentation, what methods, what reading strategies, to keep using that term, and I'll use them a little bit interchangeably, but what teaching strategies around meaning making will I bring to the game-centered classroom that might provide opportunities for a wide range of meaning-making activities? And in focusing in on the methods, I want to suggest that there are, what I want to do now is look at just 4 approaches. There are many more approaches, but just 4 approaches to meaning-making that we can keep in mind when we're giving students opportunities to play games in schools. Because what we'll see from having a go at each of these 4 approaches is that they open and close off different ways of constructing meaning. And again, we'll stick with a short video from Stray, partly because it's such a beautiful game. And I want to show another scene from the game in a moment, and then apply each of these 4 approaches: the student-centered approach, close reading, intertextuality, and a critical approach to that particular gameplay moment. Now, one of the things to take note of, even before we begin, is that this is a 40-second moment of gameplay, and this is enough for us to be able to get into some really rich exercises looking at multiple ways to construct meaning. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we're doing reading comprehension or meaning making with students, we don't necessarily need long periods of gameplay to do meaningful activities with the games that we bring into our classrooms. So let's look at student-centered meaning making. This is an approach that values what students bring with them to schooling in terms of knowledge and skills. So what do they know and what can they do? And this draws on the work of Ian Reid and Louise Rosenblatt and others to center the student. You know, it accepts, or rather recognizes, that students aren't empty vessels. Because of the range of knowledge they bring with them, or knowledges, the range of experiences and things they can do, they will make a whole range of meanings as a result of engaging with the text. And that we need to recognize that, and there's value in recognizing that and bringing that to the fore. This approach is also about seeing meaning making as a negotiation. You know, the goal isn't to try and find some kind of intended meaning of the game designer. And in fact, many of the philosophers associated with a student-centered approach, or even a structural approach to reading, might suggest it's impossible to find an intended meaning, because we're always entangled. There's always a negotiation between the game designer and the game player. And so rather than pretending there isn't, let's recognize that the reader or the student is almost a co-designer of meaning. This approach is really interested in privileging oral narratives and classroom talk, and not so much teacher talk, you know, the teacher standing up, offering a didactic approach where they tell students correct meanings, but providing opportunities for students to use dialogic talk to negotiate the range of meanings that they're constructing. And finally, it rejects assumptions about teachers somehow being the arbiters or having the correct answers, that somehow the teacher is wise enough to know exactly what the correct answer is, and we should defer to the teacher's expertise. What might this look like? Well, if we keep in mind the scene that we just saw, we might begin by giving students the chance to reflect on their textual experiences. We might ask them questions about their prior experiences of gameplay. We might ask them about their experiences of different kinds of text that we know are similar to this text. And depending on our objective, you know, we might focus in on particular kinds of knowledge construction or knowledges they bring with them from those prior textual experiences. From there, we can start to make connections between those prior experiences and the meanings they're beginning to construct from this scene. You know, maybe it's something about the music in other texts and the music in this short sequence that students are using to construct meaning. Maybe there's something about the way the cat moves that reminds them of the way the cat moves in other texts. It's likely some students who are Star Wars fans are going to be able to comment on the role of the little drone and start to make some conclusions about what the role might be in this game. And finally, talk as a resource for discussing multiple meanings. So rather than there being a correct meaning that we can put on some slides and show students, provide students with opportunities to use talk to discuss, you know, different kinds of meanings and different effects of this world, the game book. We might also construct the classroom in terms of a close reading. And close reading is typically associated with the literary tradition, with literary analysis. It's associated with the work of Ivor Richards and people like F.R. Leavis. And it captures a process or an approach to reading that is iterative, that involves repeated readings. It usually involves a focus on a very narrow portion of a text. And so if it was a play, it might be a focus on 2 lines. If it's a novel, it might be a focus on 1 paragraph. And clearly in the context of this game, I think you could focus on a 30-second moment of gameplay and do close reading of that gameplay. And what might it look like is we might show students the gameplay once, or let them play a particular moment of the game, and then ask them to write down a series of words or phrases that they use to describe the protagonist, the cat. They're starting to build up their understanding or their experience of the protagonist. We could then show the sequence again, or let them play the sequence again, and get them to focus this time on sound, on audio, on sound effects, background noise, and to begin to reflect on how this is contributing to their meaning making of this particular scene. You can then show the scene a third time. And this time, focus attention on the drone, B12. Get students to start to make some connections from this drone or this technology, and drones from other texts they've engaged. Is this similar or different? What might they anticipate about what role this drone might have in the rest of the game? And show the scene again, and this time get students to pay attention to light and darkness, to write down examples of how light and darkness is being used. So the aim is that with each reading, and it's a guided reading, with each one, students are developing an increasingly sophisticated analysis of a particular moment in the game. The third approach which we can consider is intertextuality. And I know there's a bit of text here because I wanted you to be able to see the 4 approaches that Paul Sumner has articulated with regards to film analysis. But it's intertextuality that I think is most relevant to how we might think about reading the game. And intertextuality describes the process of continual exchange. It's the idea that texts are always in relation to each other. As a result, they're always influencing the meanings that we take or construct when we engage with different texts. So the meaning derived from one text, in this case, stray, is connected to meanings and messages that we've encountered in other texts. And you heard me give an example earlier about Star Wars. It's likely that my experiences of drones and robots in Star Wars is likely going to impact on the assumptions I make about the role that B12 will have in Stray. And so what we can start to do with an intertextual reading is pay attention to these connections between texts. And one way we can do that is through thinking about student-led intertextuality. So here, we pay attention, or we make overt, the kinds of texts students have engaged with before Stray, or that they bring to Stray. What kind of films have they seen? What kind of other games have they experienced? Are there TV shows that address similar themes or similar protagonists that represent similar characters, or books? How might the meanings from these other texts prior to Stray inform the kinds of meanings that students make when they play Stray? Alternatively, we might consider this in terms of teacher-led intertextuality. So here we'd be thinking about what kinds of texts can I bring to the Stray classroom that might then lead to new opportunities for meaning making. Maybe there's a short film that explores the relationships between humans and machines that I want to show after this moment of gameplay. We can put the two side by side and look at similarities and differences. Maybe there's a couple of pages from the text. Maybe it's an art design textbook. It's looking at notions of color and design and lines and shapes. And I want to introduce these concepts at this point, and then get students to play the game and to pay attention to these kinds of design elements. Maybe there's a handout or some questions. But the idea here is that we're intentionally introducing texts for the purposes of influencing the kinds of meanings that students might make. And the fourth approach that I think is valuable for us is the notion of reading against the grain. And this is an approach to reading that is typically associated with critical literacy. It's the idea that we should be reluctant of taking texts for granted, for treating them as some kind of neutral cultural products. And instead, that there's value in working towards critiquing and challenging the kind of dominant ideologies, cultures, or representations that are embedded in game worlds, the design of games. And that if we were to be doing this kind of work, we'd be engaging in critical digital game literacies, a wide range of practices, critical reading practices, writing practices, speaking and listening practices, maybe even critical play practices. And I think there are 3 ways that we could encourage this kind of meaning making with students. So let's look at each of these briefly. So interrogating representations is about paying attention to the way the world has been represented in the game, or the world has been represented inside of the game. So here, we can draw attention, students' attention towards particular things in that game. So one way we might do this is to ask questions about the relationship between the cat and B12. What could we say about that relationship? What in this screenshot about the language reveals something about the relationship between the two? Why might the game designer be using this kind of language and using these kind of sound effects when B12 is active? How are they positioning us as an audience, as a game? What questions might we ask about the representation of robots? Why are they wearing clothes? Why do some robots have wigs and caps? Cultural things that are typically associated with humans. Again, how we've been positioned to think about this part of the game world. And then how might we place these representations alongside representations from outside of the game to do some juxtaposition, to highlight some of those similarities and differences so that students can start to interrogate or challenge some of the assumptions in these particular characters, if you like. Thinking about critical play. Critical play is a very interesting one because it's not always an option available to us in algorithmically designed worlds, which game worlds are. Two ways of thinking about it are in terms of Zagal's work, which says that through play, play can encourage us to reflect on ethical issues, so that some games are designed in such a way that they force us to think about the world in more critical, ethical ways. And Mary Flanagan's work, who's interested in play as participation. And through this participation, we can critique regimes of power. These might be regimes associated with gender or class or race, colonialism, capitalism, a whole range of aspects of our real world that have been built into the digital world. Three approaches to this that might be available to us that would influence the kinds of opportunities for critical meaning making. One is through play. As I mentioned, not all games are designed to allow critical play. It'd be very challenging to play Tetris in a way that's critical of how the game had been designed. But there are some games that allow us to navigate that game world in ways that transgress, where we push back against the assumed or correct kinds of play that the game designers would like us to pursue. Another way is to engage in game redesign, to redesign aspects of that game in some kind of game design software. Third way is to take this critical activity offline, outside of the digital, to use butcher's paper and pens and pencils to design board games, if you like, that include elements of the game, like Stray, that might start to introduce some new elements that challenge some of the ways that the game was designed, that pose questions or push back against some of the ways that game designers wanted us to play this particular game. So in all of these examples, we're giving students the chance to read, if you like, to make meanings that are critical, that don't just accept all of the knowledge that's built into that game world. The third way we might do this is through revealing connections or putting connections side by side and allowing students to start to explain the nature of those connections. And so the example you have on your screen has the game Stray connecting to the game platform Steam. And by putting these together, or side by side, if you like, students might start to explore the relationship between these two technologies, something that they might not otherwise have done if they were simply playing Stray. So here they might start to talk about the economic relationship between the game developers and platform Steam. They might start to talk about data collection and how data is collected from us when we play a game like Stray that Steam can then sell to third parties. They might start to talk about some of the social connections, the way others can see which games we own, or can see us playing a particular game and then become involved. And of course, there are a whole range of elements of gaming and game worlds. You can see many of them here that we could put side by side that would allow students to start to make meanings outside of the game that would influence their understanding of the world inside of the game and start to challenge those social, cultural, and economic relations that exist with video games. But that can be hard to uncover. They're below the surface. And what we're doing is putting them front and center for critical attention. One last thing to keep in mind is that with this approach to meaning making, what we're likely going to encounter are what I'm calling unstable meanings. Now, if you think of the more didactic classroom, where the teacher is the arbiter of what is correct, and there is a single correct meaning is stable, and reading becomes an exercise in uncovering a truth, a correct, true reading. But when we're deploying some of the approaches that I've been introducing today, what we realize is the classroom becomes a space of multiple, many meanings, sometimes contradictory meanings. And so we're less likely to think about a game or a text, if you like, as some kind of, objective cultural objective technology that carries knowledge. And we're more interested in what's happening in the active processes, the relations between people and things, students and games, teachers and games and students, and how all of these are tied up in kind of entanglements. And I won't talk through these 4 examples of these entanglements here, but what you can see is that the classroom space that shifts towards meaning making is likely to start to think about meanings and texts in ways that might make some people more uncomfortable. Textual meanings are unstable. That's an uncomfortable idea. We're used to the idea that the teachers have, the solutions, the correct answers. Text as ephemeral, the idea that there are relations between the social, people, material things, the texts that impact on what's produced. So it's worth keeping this in mind when we're designing activities that might result in many kinds of meanings that kind of challenge each other in that classroom space. And of course, you can see here a connection to that earlier work from form and how reading becomes entangled with lots of other factors in that classroom space. And that there are some questions for us to ask around how reading fits with these other factors. How does the purpose of my introduction or incorporation in video games influence what kind of reading or viewing or playing becomes possible? What is it about features of my context, the knowledge students bring with them, particular school subject area, maybe the kinds of physical space I'm in that might open up or close off particular kinds of planes or meaning makings? What values around knowledge, skills, experiences do I have that will impact on what I think about meaning making? And as you've no doubt realized over the last 5-10 minutes, what are my approaches? How might different approaches, my methods, my pedagogies produce or influence the kinds of meanings that students might make? So in our first session, we were interested in school learning and conceptual learning and how that bringing digital games into classroom spaces in and of itself isn't enough. If we want to be able to leverage these technologies for conceptual learning, we're going to need to pay careful attention to what we do with them, to the pedagogical. In this section, I've been interested in how we might shift from reading to ways of making meaning, and how different approaches to making meaning will provide different opportunities for students to engage with knowledge that might be found within a particular game, and the kinds of knowledge, the curriculum knowledge, that we want them to show mastery of. In our third session, which is coming up, we're going to focus more specifically on planning and designing questions and some of those more logistical questions around how do we organize or configure game spaces for potential teaching and learning moments.